It wasn't just a film, it was a ritual disguised as cinema, a blood-soaked labyrinth where pain seduced pleasure, and flesh became a playground for gods who don't believe in mercy. In 1987, Hellraiser burst through the veil of conventional horror with rusty hooks and whispered promises of ecstasy through agony. Written and directed by Clive Barker, it didn't simply aim to scare, it dared to awaken something darker, stranger, and deeply personal. A world where the line between suffering and desire is not just blurred, it's worshipped. This isn't your typical haunted house or masked killer story. This is an invitation into a dimension ruled by the Cenobites, creatures who don't kill out of malice, but out of sacred devotion to sensation. And at the heart of it all is Pinhead. Calm, poetic, and utterly inhuman. But what lies behind the puzzle box, behind the latex and gore, and behind Barker's fever dream of spikes and sinew? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. Hellraiser facts soaked in controversy, obsession, and truths the MPAA hoped you'd never see. Fact: Hassan, the lead Cenobite, was never supposed to speak. When Clive Barker first envisioned the Cenobites, they were meant to be silent. No dialogue, just the wet sound of metal dragging across bone. Pinhead, or lead Cenobite as he was originally credited, was to be nothing more than a visual specter, a priest of pain whose presence was enough. But actor Doug Bradley, trained in classical theater, delivered his lines with such haunting precision during a rehearsal that Barker changed his mind. He rewrote entire scenes on the spot, crafting dialogue that blended Victorian poetics with Lovecraftian horror. That calm voice, drenched in philosophy and doom, wasn't part of the plan, it was an accident. And here's the twist. The studio hated it. They wanted a mute monster, a Freddy Krueger knockoff without the jokes. They nearly dubbed over Bradley's voice with a grunting growl in post-production. They didn't. And in doing so, they accidentally gave birth to one of the most articulate, chilling villains in horror history. Fact: #2. The blood was real, at least some of it. During the infamous resurrection scene where Frank's remains claw their way back to life from the attic floor, the gore feels disturbingly convincing. That's because part of it wasn't fake. Due to budget limitations, Barker's team used real animal carcasses from a nearby butcher to mix with the latex and syrup. Slabs of cow flesh were nailed to the floor. Real blood was sprayed to add texture. The smell? Overpowering. So much so that several crew members vomited during filming. Others wore masks or refused to enter the set altogether. It wasn't method, it wasn't art, it was necessity born from desperation. And perhaps most unsettling of all, some of that rotting flesh stayed on set for days before anyone dared to clean it. In the world of Hellraiser, even the crew couldn't escape the decay. Fact: #3. Pinhead's design was inspired by African rituals and S&M clubs. The iconic grid of nails hammered into Pinhead's skull wasn't pulled from a comic book or horror archive. It came from Clive Barker's own exploration of underground subcultures, specifically the intersecting worlds of ritual scarification and 1,980 seconds London BDSM clubs. Barker studied African tribal scarring traditions, where geometric incisions signified spiritual passage. Then he merged that with imagery from gay leather clubs, leather straps, piercings, and the aesthetic of control through pain. The result was Pinhead, a monster who didn't chase victims, but summoned them. His design wasn't meant to scream, it was meant to seduce, to offer transcendence through torment. It was pain as an invitation, not punishment. And here's the irony. The MPAA was more disturbed by his calm demeanor than the violence. They said monsters should growl, not, quote, Shakespeare. They feared what Pinhead suggested, not what he showed. Fact: #4. The puzzle box was a cinematic red herring. The Le Marchand's box, that ornate cube that summons the Cenobites, has become Hellraiser's most recognizable symbol. But here's the strange truth. It was never meant to be explained. Barker originally wrote it as an abstract gateway, more metaphor than mechanism. The how of its operation was intentionally left vague. He wanted it to feel ancient, mystical, unknowable, like a cursed artifact handed down by rumor and fear. But producers kept asking for logic. How does it open? What triggers the Cenobites? So the art department made a mechanical prop that only one person on set knew how to operate. That person had to crouch beneath the actor's hands during takes, manipulating the cube like a puppet. Even then, the box barely worked. Shots had to be edited in reverse to simulate opening effects, and yet this clunky device became a global horror icon. The irony? Viewers obsessed over its rules for decades, even though there were none. The real key wasn't how you opened it. It was that you wanted to. Fact: #5. Julia was supposed to be the main villain of the franchise. While Pinhead stole the spotlight, Hellraiser's original trajectory was far more domestic. Clive Barker envisioned Julia, the murderous stepmother, as the ongoing villain across multiple films. In Barker's words, she was Lady Macbeth in latex, a woman driven by desire, not possession. She wasn't supernatural. She didn't wear spikes, but she was willing to kill for love, over and over again. Barker planned to evolve her into a dark goddess, a female Cenobite queen rising through blood. The second film, Hellbound, was even written around that arc, but actress Claire Higgins hated horror. She refused to return long-term. And the studio? They saw the merchandise potential in Pinhead, not Julia. So, she was sidelined, killed off early, forgotten. And thus, Hellraiser traded in its original human horror for something more iconic, but perhaps less tragic. Fact hash. 6. Clive Barker's personal fetishes shaped the entire film. Hellraiser wasn't just a script, it was a confession. Before becoming a filmmaker, Clive Barker was deeply involved in London's underground S&M scene. His experiences there, the leather, the control, the rituals didn't just influence the Cenobites, they were the Cenobite. In interviews, Barker admitted that the pleasure-pain duality wasn't metaphor, it was autobiography. He described dungeons that resembled temples, punishment that felt spiritual, and above all, the idea that surrender, full surrender, could be transcendent. That's why the Cenobites don't scream, they offer. They promise to tear your soul apart, not in anger, but as a sacred gift. Many horror films exploit trauma. Hellraiser dares to eroticize it. And it leaves you wondering, was this horror? Or was it Barker's love letter to the only world where he felt free? Fact hash 7. The scariest scene was cut and then lost forever. There was once a scene in Hellraiser that made the crew uncomfortable. Not because it was violent, but because it blurred the line between pleasure and mutilation too well. The sequence showed Frank skinless, twitching, crawling toward Julia, whispering words of lust as he smeared blood across her dress. It was grotesque, erotic, and shot in one unbroken take. Test audiences reportedly walked out. One editor called it the most beautiful thing I've ever hated. The studio panicked. They demanded it be removed. Clive Barker reluctantly agreed, but only after saving the footage for a potential director's cut. That footage has never resurfaced. It wasn't destroyed. It was misplaced in an era before digital backups. Rumors persist that a private collector may own the reel. Others believe it's sitting in a mislabeled canister in a British warehouse. What we do know is this. The most psychologically disturbing moment of Hellraiser may be something we'll never see. Fact hashite. Doug Bradley was mistaken for a crew member on set. Doug Bradley, the man behind Pinhead, made one of the strangest decisions during production. He didn't want special treatment. He was so committed to the transformation that he refused to be seen out of makeup while on set. This backfired badly. In his first week, Bradley was ignored by fellow cast and crew during lunch breaks. No one talked to him. He wasn't invited to table reads. Some assumed he was a new grip or lighting tech. Bradley later admitted he felt deeply isolated, just like Pinhead. But here's the twist. This accidental alienation actually enhanced his performance. When he finally stepped in front of the camera, surrounded by Cenobite prosthetics and distant stares, he didn't have to act. He already felt like an outsider. The result? One of the most chilling horror villains in cinema, born not from rage, but from quiet estrangement. Fact hash 9. Frank's skin was made of condoms and syrup. Frank's half-formed body is a masterpiece of grotesque design, all sinew, ooze, and twitching nerves. But the materials used were disturbingly simple. To simulate stretching skin, the effects team layered latex condoms, torn and glued over puppet limbs. The shine came from a mix of KY jelly and corn syrup, dyed with food coloring and motor oil. These weren't expensive prosthetics. They were dollar store nightmares, assembled with panic and ingenuity. But what made it work wasn't just the texture, it was the lighting. Scenes were filmed in near darkness, with backlights creating silhouettes that forced the viewer's imagination to fill in the blanks. And here's the irony. Modern CGI can't replicate what a few condoms and good shadows achieved in 1987. Fact Hasson 0. The film almost got an X rating for being too wet. When Clive Barker submitted Hellraiser to the MPAA, he expected issues with the violence. But the board's biggest complaint wasn't about gore, it was about moisture. They called it excessively wet. Blood didn't just spill, it oozed, stuck, smeared across skin and leather. The resurrection scene was described as pornographic, not because of sex, but because of texture. To appease the censors, Barker had to cut several seconds from multiple scenes. Frank licking blood from the floor, a close-up of a skinless body pulsing in real time, Julia's expression as she embraces a bleeding corpse. None of these were longer than a few frames. But in horror, A few frames can stain everything. What's ironic is that Hellraiser contains less violence than many slashers of the era. What disturbed the MPAA was not how much blood there was, but how intimate it felt. Pain, in Hellraiser, wasn't an event. It was a mood. Fact Hasonon, the Chatterer Cenobite, went blind inside his mask. Nicholas Vince, who played the Chatterer, the Cenobite with no eyes and endless clicking teeth, suffered for the role in a way few actors would accept today. His mask was a full headpiece of rigid latex, sealed shut with spirit gum. It had no vision holes, no air vents, and no cooling. Once inside, Vince was completely blind and nearly deaf. He walked using a production assistant's voice as a guide. Every step was guesswork. Every gesture, half-acted, half-trusted. During one take, he tripped on a lighting rig and crashed into a wall. The crew rushed in. Barker asked if he was okay. Vince, still blind, said, "Let's go again." He later said the lack of vision helped him stay in character. The Chatterer doesn't see you. He doesn't need to. He already knows what you are. In a film about surrendering control, Vince lived it one suffocating breath at a time. Fact Hasono, Julia's death scene was rewritten at the last minute. In early drafts of Hellraiser, Julia's character was meant to survive barely. Clive Barker had plans to build her into a long-arc villainess, someone who would outgrow Frank and even rival the Cenobites. But on the final day of shooting her death scene, actress Claire Higgins pulled the director aside. She was exhausted, emotionally done. She told him, "Kill her, let her go." Barker improvised. He added the impalement scene, the statue, the screaming, the final betrayal. Julia's story ended not with power, but with pain and abandonment. The crew was stunned. No one expected the change, but in the edit room, it worked. And here's the twist. Julia's absence created a vacuum that Pinhead was more than happy to fill. The final girl wasn't a survivor. She was a ghost who chose silence. Fact Hason 3. The Cenobites had no names until fans gave them one. In the original Hellraiser script and credits, none of the Cenobites had names. Not even Pinhead. They were labeled only by description: lead Cenobite, Chatterer, female Cenobite, and Butterball. Their purpose was to represent sensation, not personality. Barker didn't want icons, he wanted archetypes. But fans had other ideas. In early horror forums and fan conventions, viewers started giving them nicknames. Pinhead was the most obvious, and it stuck. Barker hated the name at first, calling it undignified. He preferred The Priest or Hell Priest. But once merchandise and spin-offs exploded, it was too late. The audience had branded their monster. By Hellraiser 3, even the script had surrendered. Pinhead was now canon. And here's the irony. A demon that preached the obliteration of identity became the face of the franchise because fans gave him one. Fact Hason 4. The composer wrote the score before seeing the final cut. Christopher Young's haunting orchestral score for Hellraiser is often cited as one of the most elegant ever written for a horror film. Swelling strings, dark choirs, tones of dread and temptation. But Young composed much of it before seeing the finished film. Barker gave him early storyboards, rough scenes, and a simple direction. It should feel like a love story that ends in hell. Young responded with music that didn't scream. It wept. The Cenobites weren't monsters in his score. They were mournful angels, guardians of a twisted sacred order. When the final cut arrived, the music fit unnaturally well, as if the film had been edited around the score, not the other way around. And that's the strange beauty of Hellraiser, a film about chaos, stitched together by sound that feels like fate. Fact Hason 5. The studio tried to replace the entire cast with Americans. Though Hellraiser was filmed in the UK, New World Pictures, its American distributor, feared the accents would alienate US audiences. Their solution? Dub the entire cast with American voices. They went so far as to re-record full scenes with US voice actors. The original line deliveries nuanced, restrained. British were flattened into generic horror tone. Clive Barker was furious. He fought to preserve the original vocal performances and eventually won back most of them. But a few minor characters were still dubbed, and sharp-eared fans can spot the mismatched lips. The result is a Frankenstein soundtrack, half London, half Los Angeles. But here's the paradox. A film about the violation of flesh was nearly stripped of its voice. Fact X6. The production ran out of blood, so they made their own. In a film drenched in crimson, you'd expect gallons of fake blood on standby. But midway through production, the Hellraiser crew hit an unexpected wall. They ran out. The makeup team had used every commercial blood supply they had, including proprietary FX blends, Ordering more would delay filming, and Barker couldn't afford delays, so they improvised. A new blend was created using Kensington syrup, red food dye, instant coffee for depth, and dish soap for shine. It wasn't medical grade, and it stained everything: skin, fabric, walls. Actors would finish scenes with red fingerprints baked into their palms for days. In one moment of desperation, a crew member cut their own finger to study how real blood moved on camera. It worked a little too well. The improvised mix became the go-to formula for the rest of the shoot. And the irony? That homemade blood, sticky, uneven, too dark, looked more disturbing than the commercial version ever did. Real horror, it turns out, is imperfect. Fact Hasson 7. Barker rewrote the script during filming on his typewriter. Clive Barker had never directed a feature film before Hellraiser, and like many first-time directors, he arrived with a vision and a typewriter. As shooting began, Barker constantly rewrote scenes the night before they were filmed. Not just lines, entire character arcs. He would type alone in his flat, then deliver new pages to the cast the next morning, often still warm from the carriage return. Doug Bradley once joked, "The script changed more than the sets." This chaotic process gave the film a fever dream quality. Characters shift, motivations mid-scene, dialogues overlap with myth. The logic isn't always linear, but the atmosphere is undeniable. And here's what's strange. Despite its narrative inconsistencies, Hellraiser feels cohesive. Because it wasn't built on plot, it was built on obsession. Fact Hasson 8. A real dead body was allegedly smuggled onto set. This one lives in the margins between production rumor and urban legend. A member of the props department allegedly sourced a real human skull from an anatomy supplier in London unofficially, not for medical use, but for realism. When Barker asked how it was acquired, the crew member reportedly said, "Don't ask, just film fast." Later, another rumor surfaced that during the attic scenes, one of the skeletal torsos was not synthetic. It smelled different. It moved differently when rigged. Nothing was confirmed. But one thing's certain. Hellraiser attracted people willing to cross lines: artistic, legal, anatomical. And if true, that means one of the film's most iconic scenes might contain an actual corpse. Real or myth, nobody ever said Hellraiser played by the rules. Fact Hassoninen. The film was originally titled Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave. Before it was Hellraiser, Clive Barker had a very different and far more confrontational title in mind: Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave. It wasn't a joke. That was the working title Barker submitted to the studio. He wanted to signal, without apology, that the film wasn't about ghosts or slasher tropes. It was about desire, about surrender, about pain elevated to metaphysics. The studio recoiled. Test audiences laughed. The marketing team begged for something less explicit. Several alternatives were floated, including Hellbound, The Hellbound Heart, and Demonic, before Barker landed on Hellraiser, a term that didn't exist before, and yet felt inevitable. Here's the irony. A film about forbidden experience almost sold itself like a midnight cartoon, but even neutered, the title still stuck a hook into the psyche and pulled. Fact #20. Pinhead was almost voiced by someone else entirely. Despite Doug Bradley's now iconic performance, there was a brief moment razor-thin but very real when another actor nearly dubbed over his voice. The studio felt Bradley's original delivery was too articulate for a horror villain. They wanted something guttural, animalistic, more monster, less monk. Barker pushed back, but pressure mounted. An American voice actor was brought in for test dubs. The results? Laughable. Pinhead sounded like a wrestling announcer reading poetry. In the end, Barker convinced producers to keep Bradley's voice elegant, chilling, measured. He didn't bark, he whispered truth. And that decision changed horror history. Because sometimes, silence delivered with precision is more terrifying than any scream. Bonus fact: the Cenobites were never the villain. It's easy to think of the Cenobites as monsters: hooks, chains, mutilation. The imagery screams villainy. But that's not how Clive Barker saw them. In his original conception, the Cenobites were not evil, they were explorers, priests of a higher sensation, bound not by morality, but by rules older than sin. They didn't hunt. They responded to desire, to obsession, to the opening of the box. Frank wasn't a victim, he was a volunteer. Barker once said, "They are not here to punish. They are here because you called them." And in that twisted equation, the true horror of Hellraiser is this: the Cenobites only exist because someone wanted them to. They didn't break in, they were invited. So the next time you watch Pinhead raise his hand, don't ask what he wants. Ask why you asked for him in the first place. Which of these facts made you rethink Hellraiser the most? The hidden corpse, the missing footage, or the truth behind the Cenobites' purpose? Tell us in the comments which moment unsettled you, and what film we should peel open next. And if you're still curious, good. That's exactly what the box was designed to do.